Putin expanded the nuclear doctrine in response to long-range systems that partners provided to Ukraine. Russian propaganda airwaves claim that the U.S. will be destroyed if it makes this decision. What do you think is the real threat from Russia at present? Certainly, broadly speaking, tensions have risen, and the atmosphere, even when there are no obvious practical threats, always creates a certain risk of random events. But in general, if you go back to the propagandists who talk about wiping the States or Britain into nuclear ashes, they forget or don't realize one thing. In the event of a nuclear war with NATO, I don't know what will happen to the NATO bloc, but it certainly won't be all good, to put it mildly. However, Russia will cease to exist. It should just call things by their proper names. Russia will cease to exist. When propagandists hear this argument, perhaps they will have other thoughts about whether it is even worth thinking about starting a nuclear war that will end with them and their relatives and their country literally gone. This is why nuclear war has always been feared in the West, the East, and the Soviet Union. Nothing has changed now, except that Russia is much weaker than the Soviet Union. Including in terms of the scale and quality of nuclear capabilities. That doesn't mean Russia can't do damage, but it will face serious challenges. So the situation from a practical point of view is this, and in fact the changes in nuclear doctrine, and I assume that Putin and his people understand perfectly well the balance of power and what a conditional nuclear war could entail. Therefore, the changes in nuclear doctrine should be interpreted as another step in the strategy of intimidating the West. Nuclear blackmail is the most important part of this strategy. It also has other components: hybrid warfare against Western countries, cyber sabotage, real sabotage in Europe, fake information attacks, transferring weapons to odious regimes and terrorist organizations like the Houthis, which has been talked about a lot. But nuclear pressure and threat is one component. And just in the run-up to Trump's inauguration, they decided to take this step. First, to update the threat level that has been issued for more than 2 years, because you have to come up with something new. Secondly, it may be thought that this is a particularly good move, specifically for the Trump administration, because Trump supporters, when discussing excessive or unnecessary aid to Ukraine, have made the argument that it could lead to World War III and escalation with Russia. Here is Russia in this way trying to threaten a much stronger party with World War III, from which it not only will not emerge victorious, but will not emerge at all. The Biden administration's decision was unexpected, given Joe Biden's previous policies. On the one hand, it is surprising. On the other hand, the chances of it were high. The initially cautious policy lowered expectations, and such decisions had been made before on many systems. However, what was on the other side? From the last 2 years, one could conclude that the Americans, due to one or another war-related events, were overcoming the barriers that they themselves had set up. After the crimes in Bucha and the Kiev region, arms deliveries were intensified, and after the strikes on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure in the fall of 2022, a decision was made to intensify aid. I remind you that after the capture of Volchansk and the attack on Kharkiv Oblast, strikes on Russian territory with Western weapons were authorized. Without this authorization, the operation in the Kursk region might have been impossible, or it would have been necessary to arm units exclusively with non-Western weapons. So, the Americans dared to take these steps, and the reasons for them were events such as possible assistance to Russia from its allies. This could have been the trigger for another move, such as authorizing a strike on Russian territory. Anyway, the US used this as a tool to pressure Russia. If you don't hit targets in Ukraine or take Iranian ballistic missiles, we won't supply Ukraine with weapons. But if you do otherwise, we will take steps. I am sure that this has happened more than once. It may not be talked about out loud, but if the Russians are taking decisive steps, then they must be punished. This is apparently the logic of the Biden administration. But there is one more main point. As we know, in any democratic country, almost every politician prioritizes the desire to win elections and the victory of his party, often overriding important national interests. And even more so over the interests of other countries. Anything that could even slightly interfere with the election campaign of the Democratic Party could not be carried out. But after the election, hands are untied, and the Biden administration made a cautious decision, the details of which we don't know. For example, it was said that the geography was stipulated by Kursk Oblast, which looked absurd. Practice has shown that if ATACMS missiles are used against a warehouse in Karachev, it is possible to hit the Bryansk region as well. And I will assume that Ukraine is unlikely to have violated the ban, if it exists. Here's a look at the accuracy of the plum content, or perhaps intentional misinformation. Moreover, today, there was information that all strikes that Ukraine will carry out with long-range weapons of the United States and partners must be coordinated with the United States. On the one hand, the reason is technical, because we do not have satellite data, and the United States provides it. On the other hand, what do you think? Wouldn't that be a kind of deterrent for our country? First of all, if that's the case, if you have to ask the Americans for permission for each specific target, then yes, that's a deterrent and a limiting factor. The question, I had no doubt that there are such restrictions, and that, first of all, only military targets, strictly military targets, and not something related can be attacked. I highly doubt that military targets could be attacked, say, within the confines of a large city, let's say. I mean, in theory, the target is legitimate, but within the city limits, I'm afraid I may be wrong, but to avoid risks, there may be bans on it. As for the coordinates and specifically the ATACMS missiles, I have my doubts. This could be Storm Shadow missiles, where it is important to enter coordinates to optimize the route. ATACMS only need GPS coordinates of targets. Ukraine can have them without American help, for example, to attack stationary targets. it is unclear whether the U.S. has the capability to thwart such an attack. If the Americans require harmonization, it is a limitation. But as has already been said, no one doubts that it will be lifted. At the same time, many analysts are now saying that for our country is coming, well for our country, and also probably for democratic countries around the world, because everybody is now really very actively following what is happening in Ukraine, embedded in what is happening in our country. Now the decisive stage of this war is coming, and Putin is using every possible force and means before Trump's inauguration to get a situation on the battlefront. How do you assess the current stage until January 20? How decisive is it? Because they said that this is a critical moment for receiving aid from the U.S. How important is it for Ukraine to strengthen its position before Trump's inauguration? First of all, it is necessary. But I would like to point out that regardless of the U.S. election, the most important thing for Putin is to win. For him, the minimum goal is to win, at least on points, so that it looks like a victory in the eyes of the vast majority of Russians. He may have more visionary goals, but that is the minimum. Moreover, Russia was already making efforts, unrelated to the election and Trump's inauguration, to succeed on the battlefield territorially to wear down Ukraine. Indirectly wear down Ukraine's Western partners and create more favorable conditions for further advancement or peace on terms favorable to Russia. These efforts are ongoing as it is, and these are the current goals of the war. Of course, in light of Trump's election victory, the situation will change one way or another from what it was. To what extent and in what direction, we can only guess. There are speculations, but it's hard to predict anything for sure. So, let's say, to achieve slightly better results before Trump takes office would be logical from their side. And vice versa, from the Ukrainians' point of view, it is logical to maintain a more urgent and stronger position. But on the other hand, it's still the same, what I'm saying now, for some to succeed offensively and for the Ukrainians to succeed defensively. That would still be the right approach, even if there were no elections. And if there were no elections, would Russia wave its hand and say in the Kremlin, all right, let's move forward slowly? Of course not. Next, a lot depends on what strategy will be undertaken by the new U.S. president. This is really the most important event. It cannot be overemphasized, and it is more important than holding or losing a city on the front, because it can have strategic significance for the course of the war or its end. It will be interesting to see to what extent Putin, for example, if Trump makes some proposal, will be cooperative, to what extent he will show himself amenable to pressure. Because so far, under the current administration and the rest of Ukraine's partners, Putin has not shown a willingness to compromise. More recently, Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov, in response to Erdogan's unofficial plans to freeze the front lines, reiterated his previous positions, and no one was pulling Peskov's tongue. Пресс-атташе Песков в ответ даже на неозвученный план Эрдогана о заморозке линии фронта So this is clearly part of the strategy, repeating Putin's ultimatum demands to Ukraine, which imply, let me remind you, the seizure and annexation with the recognition of Ukraine as Russian, of the entire Zaporizhzhia region, the entire Kherson region, and the entire Donetsk region. But these are not all the demands, because when such demands are repeated at the highest level, this is not a demonstration of readiness for compromise. And that's hardly something that would please the future president of the United States when he talks about some kind of negotiations and trying to make a deal. Although, once again, I'll say it's too early to predict. We have to wait for the cases, and the case is not long to wait. What you are talking about, the analysts of The Economist also write about it, that indeed the United States now, the Trump administration, will need to resolve the war in Ukraine, and most likely there will be pressure on the Ukrainian side. These are such assumptions from analysts. The first reason for this is that the United States does not want to support Ukraine financially, but the main thing is not the financial side, but the fact that from a military point of view, it is necessary to support Israel and Taiwan to be partners for these countries. Accordingly, the burden on the United States from Ukraine should be reduced. Do you think that this kind of talk is the United States really going to pressure Ukraine to give up some of its territories? And the fact that now there is no such ability or willingness of our partners to continue such support, to what extent is that really true? And there are no resources? And what can you say about support for Israel and Taiwan? How seriously is the United States now invested in this partnership? First of all, we know how invested the Biden administration is. When the new administration comes in, everything will start from scratch. But for now, it's all just considerations and speculation. When we talk about the Economist article and the estimates voiced, part of it is the legitimate opinion of the authors. That's understandable. They may have heard something from some people close to them. I don't rule it out either. They draw conclusions on the basis of all sorts of statements during the election campaign. It's all a question of interpreting American interests here. To say that the Americans don't have the money and means would be wrong, especially since, as I see it, let's say Ukraine's defeat on points. Moreover, because of that the Americans stop their aid to Ukraine or cut it off and start to actively pressurize it, in my opinion, is absolutely not in American interests. I am now speaking from the point of view of pragmatism and realpolitik. Rewarding the aggressor and pressuring the victim of aggression is immoral and can degrade the perception of the U.S. as an ally. It doesn't matter that one administration is this way and the other is that way. There has to be a certain consistency, especially consistency in doing the right thing. So, if something like this happens without taking into account what's happening with Ukraine in all regions of the world, whether it's the Asian region, which is a priority for the United States, where Taiwan, South Korea, allies, and other countries, including Japan, of course, it's also the Middle East. If you think about other places, Europe, both Western and Eastern, will all realize, and realize definitively, that relying on the Americans in the long term is not possible, which will lead to very difficult practical conclusions, including that many countries will have to bow to Iran, China, Russia. For the United States, the situation will become strategically much more difficult. As far as funds are concerned, they are certainly in short supply. Funds are never excessive. Nevertheless, the economy of the United States and even more so in combination with Western allies. Is such that they could have assisted Ukraine on a much larger scale than they do now, which would have improved results on the battlefield and allowed Putin to realize the hopelessness of his efforts sooner. However, that was not done, and under Biden, I don't know how it will be now or what will happen in the future. As for the money, it's important to realize that not only is not a lot of it spent on a U.S. scale, a significant amount of it stays in U.S. military-industrial companies, and it's a kind of subsidization of the economy. Yes, it's certainly not a perfect approach, but it's not a bad thing to keep the money in your own companies either. By the way, this is in the interests of voters, including Republicans and President Trump personally. The interests of Americans, it seems to me, if we consider them in a traditional way, look like this. But everyone has their own interests, and everyone, explaining their actions, can interpret it in different ways. In terms of aid to Israel, a significant additional $14 billion in aid to Israel was ordered as part of the hung aid package when both packages were hung up in Congress, although there are specific breakdowns. This aid, unlike in Ukraine, is not concentrated for a short period of time, and the money will be used, for example, to order fighter jets that will arrive in 2031, or to invest in the production of interceptor missiles for missile defense, which is also stretched out over many years. I must say, despite the grievances and problems with the Biden administration that the Israeli leadership had and has, one cannot help but appreciate this aid highly because it is of great importance. What will happen in the future is difficult to say. We can tentatively conclude that, based on the previous cadence, Trump's policy toward Israel will be more favorable than that of the current administration. However, I'm never quick to make optimistic or pessimistic predictions. In the end, actions speak louder than words, and much depends on the team that surrounds the president as well as the party line. Some appointments, like the future ambassador to Israel, seem quite promising, but this is a classic case. An ambassador can be a very positive person, yet still follow the directives of the State Department and the party line, which has yet to be fully defined. Israel faces serious tests, and one of them is what to do about Iran. It would be useful to solve this problem, at least partially, because Iran is a threat to the whole world, including Ukraine and Middle Eastern countries. The terrorist attacks in Europe, the assassination attempts on Trump and other politicians are also the result of Iran's actions. What happens with that? We'll see. On what to do with Iran, do you have any suggestions? We see what Israel has done with Hamas. The issue of post-war Gaza is now being addressed. Benjamin Netanyahu recently said that there will be no more Hamas in the enclave, but for it to disappear from Gaza, or at least significantly weaken it, additional steps need to be taken, and the whole question is which ones Israel will decide.
Хамаса в заметной степени разгромлен как организованная военная сила, но для того, чтобы он исчез из Газы или в заметной степени исчез, необходимы еще дополнительные шаги. И весь вопрос в том, как на какие...
What Netanyahu is talking about is rather ahead of the curve, although he is probably talking about it for a reason. The situation with Iran is very interesting. A lot will depend on the U.S. Whereas so far the U.S. has pressured Israel in military operations, trying to prevent escalation.
Интересно, потому что очень многое будет зависеть от Соединенных Штатов. Если до сих пор Соединенные Штаты давили на Израиль во всех отношениях, то есть когда мы говорим о проведении военных операций почти на всех фронтах, которые сейчас боевых действий, которые Израиль ведет, почти везде, если не сказать везде, было колоссальное американское давление с целью недопущения эскалации. Это привело к многочисленным задержкам, введению частичных эмбарго на поставку оружия и многое-многое другое, и мы еще не знаем элементов...
This has led to delays, arms embargoes, and many other measures.
Как я слышал, волосы дыбом встают, но что не выплескивалось в прессу. Так вот сейчас, если подход американской администрации изменится, если они не то что поймут, а...
We don't yet know all the elements of the behind-the-scenes communication, but if the U.S. administration concludes that Iran poses a serious threat to their interests and to world security, the U.S. has serious options, both military and economic, to put Iran in its place. These could be stifling sanctions that would damage the regime so badly that it could not recover, or they could be the threat of force as a last resort. In addition, if Israel concludes that it is necessary to take decisive action with its own forces against Iran, a conclusion that has been increasingly suggested, I would say, in recent weeks, and will probably become even more so in the coming weeks and months, then the Americans will have to give Israel maximum cooperation, and certainly not get in the way. Here is a combination of points about both the U.S. attitude toward Israel and its approach to the Iranian problem. Let's see what changes. I have a certain optimism, but I'm very cautious. And I'll say again, it's too early to draw conclusions before the real steps are taken. It's all going to come down to how the administration sees the American interest, how it sees it. That's what it's going to do. If this interest does not coincide with Israel's interests, they will realize exactly their own and not something else. We have been watching the relationship between Israel and the U.S., and in my opinion, Israel has not allowed the full-fledged pressure and containment policy that the U.S. is trying to apply in Ukraine. What do you think Ukraine needs, first of all, in order to cooperate with its partners, but at the same time not to feel this pressure? I mean, the policy of containment.
Сотрудничали с партнерами, но при этом не ощущали вот этого вот давления, я имею в виду в качестве политики сдерживания, то, что, там, скажем, нам не вовремя поставляется оружие, там есть очень много условий, когда нам дают определенные разрешения, которые нам не...
For example, when weapons are not delivered on time or permits are delayed. Israel is under severe pressure, and the results are often partial. Sometimes Israel refuses to take the best steps, and sometimes it takes them with delays, increased losses, and costs. For example, I'm talking about the Rafah operation in the Gaza Strip, which Israel took 3 months to decide on. And in the end, half agreeing, half overcoming pressure, they decided on it with a huge delay, which brought problems. But on the other hand, the fact that they decided to go ahead with it, despite the tough approach of the United States, was a significant strategic victory. The addiction remains. There are bombs bought, but not delivered, which hinders the fighting. It is impossible to get rid of dependence completely, especially when the partner has his or her own interest that differs from yours.
в случае Израиля и Украины полностью от нее избавиться и близко невозможно. Когда ты зависишь от партнера, в тот момент, когда старший партнер имеет свой особенный, отличающийся от твоего интерес, он всегда даст о тебе знать. И вот здесь
He will always make himself known.
искусство политического маневра, несмотря на зависимость и давление.
It is important to maneuver skillfully, pushing the partner in some cases, and in other cases, to yield. It is necessary to strive for bilateral support for years to come, creating common interests and ties.
Поэтому, что тут сказать? С одной стороны, важно иметь, скажем так, иметь максимум успеха во всем, что касается понимания внутриамериканской политики.
And of course, it is a question of the art of those in power, who understand the subtleties of American policy, and based on their own interests, know how to maneuver, where to press, where to concede, where to capitulate, to bring this art to a high level. Otherwise, the states dependent on American aid will have a hard time. And for countries that are at war against strong adversaries, this is especially important, since much depends on the Americans. David, at the end of our conversation, I would like to discuss the current situation in Ukraine. Russia recently carried out missile launches on Ukrainian territory from the Tu-95 MS. 4 aircraft allegedly returned to Russian territory, but the missiles did not enter our airspace. These fake launches have been carried out by Russia on numerous occasions. At the same time, there was a massive shelling. Ukrainians are kept in high tension. On the other hand, a video of Russia shooting Ukrainian prisoners of war has appeared in Telegram channels.
Осуществила буквально, ну, по крайней мере, так вот пишут телеграм-паблики, осуществила пуски ракет по территории Украины с Ту-95 МС. 4 борта якобы сели на территории России, но вхождения ракет в наше воздушное пространство пока что не было. И вот эти вот фейковые пуски Россия...
Why do you think Russia is carrying out such terrorist actions? What does it want to achieve? And what kind of peace agreements can we talk about with such a country?
Такой вот террористический метод. С другой стороны, я сейчас вижу, опять же, в телеграм-пабликах появилось видео, как Россия в который раз расстреляла украинских военнопленных. Тоже террористический метод. Как вы считаете, вот эти вот...
As I understand it, the democratic world, and the United States among them, has never been tolerant of terrorists, although it has sometimes been tolerant of regimes. If you look back in history, you can see how there have been collusions with terrorists, astonishing collusions with regimes in the countries of Europe. History is rich. What to do the Western world, too, understands the language of force and tends to tire, especially in the context of support and confrontation. Therefore, the proposal to establish a ceasefire and end the war and let it be what it will sometimes seems a tempting goal.
Что делать, и западный мир тоже понимает язык силы, и западный мир склонен уставать, и в том числе во всем, что касается...
But I hope that in a forward-looking perspective, we should not sacrifice important strategic goals and create serious threats to ourselves.
Установить перемирие, закончить войну, а там будь что будет, кажется довольно заманчивой целью иногда. Я надеюсь, что для дальновидных политиков все выглядеть будет не так просто. Вот так вот, ради какого-то краткосрочной перспективе некого примирения пожертвовать очень серьезными стратегическими целями и создать для себя
That's in general terms.
серьезные угрозы. Это в общих чертах.
Russia's actions are clear enough. We have been observing them for several weeks now, and Ukrainians are experiencing it for themselves. Every night, there are massive attacks, which are regular in nature and have several objectives: destruction of infrastructure, distraction and exhaustion of Ukrainian air defenses, expenditure of air defense resources, and so on. But in addition, the purpose of the psychological impact is absolutely obvious. When we see the alarms 3 times a night in Kyiv, for example, this does not only apply to Kyiv, but throughout the night, it is obvious that this is an impact on the psyche, a physical impact on all the residents of Ukraine, primarily on the residents of major cities and on the Ukrainian authorities. When people don't sleep, when they are nervous every night, it has a physical effect. The last few days also appear to have added massive missile attacks. There has already been a raid. All the embassies, when we talk to you, are talking about preparing a new missile strike on Ukraine. What can I say? This is part of the strategy: intimidation, psychological pressure, and hitting different targets along the way. Something that Russia has never given up on throughout the war. But the psychological component, these daily raids, in my opinion, illustrate it vividly. The methods are known, and in general there is nothing new. It is new, except in some nuances.